The content of this channel is for mature audiences. Parental discretion is advised. You're tuned in to the Green Gorilla channel. Please make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell notification button. And please, feel free to share the video. Thank you.
Yo, what's good, everybody? I'm GG, man. You're tuned in to the Green Gorilla channel. It is the place where black men can express themselves freely, straight up, no chases. And before I get things started, man, I want to give a shout out to all the haters out there, man. You already know. Hope y'all having a pleasant afternoon, man. If you haven't done so already, man, when you come in, could you please hit the like button, the subscribe button, and the bell notification button so you can stay on top of what's going on here on the Green Gorilla channel, man. Thank you. And also, as I always do before I get things started, I want to give a shout out to all of the members of the Green Gorilla channel on both the Patreon side and on the YouTube side. So let me get that process started. And after that, we can get down to the business at hand. I'm just waiting for my computer, man, to actually speed up so I can do what I need to do, man. All right, man. So shout out to Anthony Davis, I'm Just Jules, Brotherly Love 215, Michael Rossley Ways, Black's Word 404, An Honest Look at the End, John J. and Afro National. Big up to them. Big up to Sherlyn Rowe, Wiki Dawson, Stefan, Julius Ferguson, Lord Hamal, Truth 7360, Mr. Me Too, Call for President, Broken Blade, Leading from the Black, and J. Cleveland Green. Big up to y'all. Also, big up to Gold Professor, Seven Coast Dojo, AKs and Curtains, H-Town, Roguish the Buildmonger, BD Main, Adrian Thompson, Electrician 480, Benga, and Cutting Up with the Jones. Big up to Zanko, D. Scott, Path Guy, Pete Rock, Aaron Peters, Barnolis, Dar, Vincent Lindsay, Michael Pierce, Beautiful Trauma, Quiz the Poet, Black Wizard, Jazz Tech, Shadow Observer, Sugar T, Artisan MC, Nasiana, Kyle J. Sura, Kareem, Troy, Mrs. KP Bailey, Alan Wiley, DeFace, Mantis on Break, Life of Commerce, Dreamlit, A. Wilson's Ghost, Timothy Blewett, Jeffrey Speed, Marvin Battle Jr., and Mark Hope. Big up to them. Big up to Afro Troop TV, Adam, BGS Ibmore, Ignatz Mouse, Brian Peaks, Papa Didas, Scott Haywood, and Black Uru Strikes. Big up to y'all. Big up to Dr. Tree, Leroy Honeycutt, Super Tech, 77 Base X, Brian McMurray, Karan S., Charles Rogers, Rick Ross, Sandra Jean, Charles Gilmore, Patricia Colley, Greg, Barry Little, Mr. Valentino, Jason Hales, and Black Men Being Brutally Honest. Big up to y'all. Big up to Cameron, Doc LaRock, Mark Swift, Odd Collard, Donald Watts, Coach Hotep, and Old Soul Chief. Also, big up to Mr. Blue Collar, TD Hip Hop Media, Drew Main, Mr. Heat, Sir Anthony, MLR, and Universal 178. Also, I'd like to give a shout out to Rasheed Barnes, Aaron Smith, DH, The Revelator, Aaron Infinite, Dr. Tiasan Johnson, Kalan Jakala, Hostile Adept, and WPR1. Big up to y'all. Also, on the Patreon side, I'd like to give a shout out to my patrons. Christopher Burton, thank you, sir, for becoming a Patreon patron. Prince D. Martini, Daxby, J Live, Rashawn Phillips Sorrells, Keith Bass Jr., Nick, Rock One, Albert C., Dr. Ben Vincent, I Am the Light of My Father, Waffle Weave, William Joyner, Tyrone Hampton, Darnell Smith, Excalibur, Anu 219, Presura Prisoner, Taz, Dragon 59, Jay Bailey, Mr. Michi Momal, and Asangwa. So big up to all y'all, man. And I can't forget my brothers, Forrest Windu, David Carroll, and Kevin Samuels. Big up to all of them, man. And I mean it, man. Y'all deserve a round of applause. Thank you so much for helping, me keep this thing going. I've been hit or miss sometimes. There are stretches or periods of time where, there's 4 or 5, maybe even 7 days between me doing a show to the next. And, you know, I'm not always talking about things that are salacious and things that, you know, draw a lot of attention to the channel, because I don't always talk about male-female relationships and things of that nature. But still, thank you for, you know, being patient with me and dealing with the subject matter that I speak on, and the subjects that I discuss and talk about and outline and adumbrate on the channel. So I appreciate your support, man. And if you're wondering how you could, you know, support the channel on an ongoing basis, here's how you do it. And when we come back from that, we'll get back to the business at hand. What's good, everybody? I'm the G with a PhD, and you're tuned in to the Green Gorilla channel, the place where black men can express themselves freely, straight up, no chaser. Today, I want to introduce you to my new membership program that consists of 5 levels where you can invest in the Green Gorilla channel on a monthly basis and receive level-specific perks. Memberships are special because they improve the quality of the content of the channel and will help me to be able to keep the channel going. Now, to participate in the Green Gorilla channel membership program, all you have to do is hit the join button, which is located right next to the subscribe button on my channel page. Now, for all of my subscribers who decide not to participate in my membership program, nothing will change. The content will keep coming the way it always has. Thanks for watching, and be careful out here, people. Bless. All right, man, I'm back. I'm GG. You tuned in to the Green Gorilla channel. It's the place where black men can express themselves freely, straight up and no chasers. And what I've been doing is I've been having a discussion about a book. And the name of the book is called Dark Ghettos. It's written by a black philosopher by the name of Tommy Shelby. And the book is a continuation of a discussion that, you know, was sparked in the 50s and 60s, you know, about the pathology of the black ghetto. And a bunch of, you know, proposals and, you know, outlinings and adumbrations of the, you know, the lack of virtue there have been, you know, put forth. And this is just a continuation of that. So shout out to Dar. Thank you so much for supporting the channel. I appreciate it. I really do, man. Thank you, sir. Appreciate the support. So let me get right to this, man, and kind of go over what I went over the last time, just briefly, and then get to where I want to be now, okay? So let me get there. Okay, the last time I started off, I said I was going to go over chapter 1. And I think I got to page 29 from chapter 1. But the previous section, the discussion pretty much was a discussion about what racism is, okay? And the author, again, whose name is Tommy Shelby, basically says that racism can be, in its most basic form, defined as an ideology. And, you know, if you want to see the intricacies of what he means by an ideology, you can go look at the video that I did yesterday. It's called Ghetto Ish 2, okay? And then he goes on to discuss what is called institutional racism. And then he, you know, separates intrinsic from extrinsic institutional racism. And then he goes on to discuss something that's called structural racism, okay? So after having done that, he moves into the subject matter of discrimination, which we've had yet to have a discussion about. Now, first of all, I'm reading this text because I think it's relevant to what a lot of black people in the manosphere have to say. I mean, we have a lot to say about people in the ghetto, whether they're male or female. You know, a lot of derogatory terms are thrown around, pookie and strags and things like this. I just want to have a more focused and an exhaustive and a complete discussion about the ghetto and to talk about issues related to justice for people who are from the ghetto, who live there, or, you know, your parents might still be there, or your sisters, your brothers, your cousins, who knows? I mean, you might not, you know, be a ghetto citizen. You might be a part of the black middle class. You might have grown up in the suburbs, but it's still it's still worthy of conversation, I feel. And I think that, all too often what we do is we just go off of common sense, or we use folk wisdom without actually being, sophisticated and meticulous in how we treat this subject. So anyway, so the next session is entitled, of chapter 1 of this text, is called Unjust Discrimination, okay? And so I'm just going to read through it. And maybe if, I feel like it, I'll move past this section and finish the chapter 1 up, or maybe not. I don't know. It all depends on how I feel. But anyway, so unjust discrimination, what is it? Okay. So he says, another contested concept that I use is discrimination. Most people use the label discrimination as a thick normative concept, not only to describe particular actions or policies, but also to criticize them on moral or legal grounds. It is analytically useful, however, to classify certain actions or policies as discrimination without thereby assuming or implying that everything that falls into this category is impermissible or wrong, only then to go on to ask which actions or policies in the category are objectionable, that is, wrongful discrimination, and to explain why. We should next note that discrimination necessarily involves, but is more than, judging two persons or two groups to be different, for instance, with respect to race, gender, or nationality, or valuing one type of person over another, the industrious over the lazy, and so on. The distinction or preference must also function, at least implicitly, as a basis for treating people differently, leaving aside for the moment whether the basis is sound. Okay, so discriminatory actions and policies favor some over others, or benefit some while burdening others based on some distinction or preference. Not all discrimination, so understood, is morally wrong. And I agree with this here. Not all discrimination is morally wrong. And then he uses as an example to explain why. Hiring as surgeons only those with steady hands is perfectly permissible, even though it discriminates against those with shaky hands. Moreover, the fact that a form of discrimination is wrongful does not necessarily mean that the law should prohibit it. Okay? So, and I think that that's correct as well. And look, we discriminate all the time. Now, the question is whether or not the discrimination that we use is fair or unfair, just or unjust, right or wrong. And even if it's morally wrong, as he says, he's about to use an example here, discrimination could be morally wrong, but it doesn't necessarily imply that it should be illegal. Like, say, for example, that I only want to associate with, if I'm white, which I am not, but let's say, for example, I am white and I don't want to associate with anybody else other than white people. I don't want to talk to other races of people, don't want to associate with them, really don't want to work with them, don't want to be around them. I discriminate based upon race. Now, one could argue that, is immoral, but you can't basically say that it's illegal. How are you going to, govern the moral life of an individual with laws like that? Okay. So anyway, refusal to befriend someone for no better reason than the person's race is wrongful discrimination, but it would be inappropriate to legally proscribe it. And proscribe is the opposite of prescribe. Okay. So proscribe means that you prohibit it. Okay. Whereas prescribe means that you suggest or normatively assert that it ought to be, okay? So my concern will largely be with identifying wrongful forms of discrimination that, are unjust and legitimately prohibited by government action. So basically saying, look, what I'm going to do is I'm not just going to talk about what's morally wrong. I'm going to talk about what's morally objectionable and also what's unjust from an institutional or a legal standpoint. So there's a difference there, okay? There's a difference. So then he goes on to say, so when is discrimination based on race unjust and permissibly proscribed? And he goes on to talk about what he perceives to be an influential view. An influential view is that race-based discrimination is always unjust because it's a violation of the principle of color blindness, according to which race should never be a consideration in determining how government institutions treat persons, regardless of the purpose of or rationale behind such race-conscious measures. Now that's important because this is an influential view. Okay? So you should never discriminate predicated upon race at all. You should always take the colorblind approach. And it should always be a matter of subjective discrimination based upon a person's individual merits, never anything related to their racial background or their national background or their ethnic background or their sexual background, whether it be sex in terms of sexual preference or gender. It doesn't matter, okay? So this principle is straightforward and easy to apply, but its validity is far from self-evident. What might justify it? So here are some of the arguments that people make in order to justify this idea of color blindness, right? So one argument is this, and I'll just highlight one because I'm pretty sure he's going to use more than one argument here. Race, as we've learned from history, is an invidious social distinction, so dangerous and divisive that the state, given its power, should be forbidden from using racial classification in policy and law, and perhaps should be granted the authority to restrict the use of racial distinctions by private institutions. Okay? So, that's a lot to say, okay? But the state should be forbidden from using racial classifications in policy and law, and should also perhaps maybe even extend, this notion to restrict private institutions from using racial distinctions in the development of policies, okay? So here, racial discrimination is considered unjust because of its propensity to produce negative social consequences, such as sowing social discord or reducing human welfare. There is no doubt that treating people differently because of their race often causes great harm and can be a source of strife. For this reason, it is legitimate to protect, stigmatize, and disadvantage racial groups from further harm and abuse by restricting the use of race-based distinctions in certain contexts, such as employment and policing, even when such use is not motivated by racial prejudice. Okay? Consider, for instance, the case of reaction qualifications in hiring. Now, I don't know if you've ever heard of this term or this notion, okay? Reaction qualifications. Because some people, some businesses have made this argument. Like, when I would teach an ethics course, I would often propose the following question. Let's say, for example, you own a bakery, and it's a Christian bakery, and, your clientele is predominantly a Christian-based clientele. And your primary, clientele also is people who are going to get married, okay? So you have a faith-based, a religious-based bakery that caters to people who are getting married. Now, let's say, for example, you hire people, from all different walks of life or whatever, but in a particular instance, you got a gay person who comes and they want to be hired. I mean, your business is religious based, and it's about marriage, and this person that you're hiring is pro-gay marriage. Or let's say, for example, somebody comes to the store and they want a cake from you, but instead of wanting a traditional cake where there is a depiction of a man and a woman, they want a depiction of a woman and a woman, or a man and a man. Are you obliged to give them service? Right? These are some questions. These are the kind of questions that can arise when it comes to discrimination and whether or not you're able to actually discriminate predicated upon race. But anyway, consider, for instance, the case of reaction qualifications in hiring. Here, race is treated as a basis for discrimination, not because the employer is racist, but because of the likely reactions of others to the race of her employees. So let's say, for example, you have a steakhouse off a county road and the clientele is predominantly white. And then let's say, for example, some Negro appears to the job and asks for an application, and he gets denied on the grounds that, look, I don't think that the people who service my restaurant would actually be happy with a black waiter working here. Colors need not apply. Okay? So this is the whole point of the notion of reaction qualifications, because some businesses have made these claims, okay? But because of the likely reaction of others to the race of her employees. The difficult question here is when reliance on reaction qualifications is consistent with racial justice. If one's customers do not want to be served by blacks, then it might hurt the profitability of one's business to hire blacks. And if this racist preference is sufficiently widespread in society, then hiring blacks could threaten the life of the business itself, and perhaps one's livelihood. One reasonable response to this problem is to legally prohibit the use of reaction qualifications in employment when consumer reactions are based on racial animus or prejudice. Perhaps accommodating the prejudices of customers in order to ensure a profitable business isn't intrinsically unjust. However, these preferences demean and burden the members of disadvantaged racial groups. The state can be justified in restricting the use of such preferences to protect already stigmatized groups from further disadvantage and humiliation. So in this case, you can hear the author, Shelby, saying, yeah, the excuse of reaction qualifications is the state can intervene in that in that argument, or intervene and say, well, that's not enough for you to justify the racial discrimination. So that's the case that he's using in order to give an example of a situation in which the state can intervene on discrimination, okay? Anyway, he goes on to say, considerations of corrective justice enjoin us to institute policies that lessen the burdens on the oppressed and that make it more difficult for employers and public officials to mistreat them. Now, the funny thing about that is, if you're a black person, right, and you apply to a job, how will you ever know? Unless it's blatantly stated. How would you ever know whether or not you've been discriminated against predicated upon your race? How will you know? How can you be certain? And shout out to Joe from DC. Appreciate that. Appreciate that. Thank you, sir. To Joe from DC. Yeah, and so when you start this whole racial issue, man, it's a real tricky subject, man. But if you're a black person, how do you know? How do you know? But anyway, he goes on to say, but is the state's use of racial distinctions unjust, no matter the purpose or context? Okay. And I think he's right here as well when he says there are good reasons to doubt this. Can the state use racial distinctions that are just. And that's just another way of saying not unjust, okay? So there are good reasons to doubt this. Yet even if we were to grant that on grounds of general welfare and administrative efficiency, it would be better if the state didn't treat people differently because of their racial classification. This thesis is distinct from the popular idea that all racial discrimination is intrinsically unjust, that people have a right not to have their race considered in public decision-making, no matter the rationale. So it's, so some people just think that, like the colorblind thesis is going to say all racial distinctions are intrinsically unjust. But as far as I'm concerned, that's just a strategy utilized by white folks in order to be able to covertly practice racial discrimination in plain view, and to act as if, they've avoided, utilizing race in the first place. But that's just my opinion on that. I think I'm right about that opinion, but, it's my opinion on it. Anyway, can the colorblind principle make sense of this idea? One approach used by advocates of colorblindness is to argue the persons should be treated not as representatives of their race, but instead as individuals. There are no group rights, only rights of individuals to equal treatment. However, the use of classifications and generalizations in law and public policy is ubiquitous. And I agree with that. I mean, this is just the facts, right? There are discriminatory practices all across society, and some of them are justified, some of them are unjustified. But to argue that we can't separate people into groups and, to treat them differently, or to, evaluate them differently, or to give, different duties or responsibilities, or to grant rights to these groups, to act as if that's not a possibility, I just think that that's wrong. Without doing something unjust, I think that that's wrong. So I agree with the author here. So he says, imagine trying to make policies or laws without relying on broad categories, such as persons over the age of Y. Like, for example, we say persons over the age of, or under the age of 15, they can't get access to a driver's license. They can't buy alcohol or cigarettes. We don't say that that's unjust discrimination against people under the age of 15. We just don't say that, okay? Or persons who scored at least Z on the exam. I mean, so we also have criteria by which we say if you're not competent related to, your score on this exam, unless you score 80%, you can't move on to the next level. That even happens in driving examinations. Like if you don't score a certain set of points on a driver examination, you can't get the license. Or you can't take the physical test, right? So the actual driving test, right? These classifications treat persons as individuals no more than racial classifications do. And they do not presuppose that groups rather than individuals have rights. So he goes on to say a more plausible approach is to argue that public institutions should not advantage or disadvantage persons because of traits they possess for which they are not responsible. So this is how he responds to the colorblind argument, right? One's relative life prospects should depend solely on one's choices and effort, because an individual's race, whether understood as biological or social, is an immutable characteristic that the individual is not responsible for having. The state should not allow it to affect the person's relative life chances. And that, I don't know how you feel about this argument, but I mean, commonly this is the kind of argument, we call it the natural lottery argument. And that people should not be responsible for attributes or characteristics about themselves over which they are not responsible. So no morality should be attributed to your race. I mean, you didn't decide to be black. You just are. You didn't decide to be, if you want to be more accurate, you did not decide, if you are a person of African descent, to be a person of African descent. It's just a fact of who you are that happened by chance. Or let's say, for example, even your sex. I mean, things are getting kind of like crazy now where people are saying that you can decide what sex you are. But I mean, besides all of the craziness associated with the new gender fluidity movement, I mean, you really, for the most part, you have no control over your born sex. You don't get to decide before you're born what sex you're going to be. So those are arbitrary, one could say, from a moral point of view. Okay, that's usually how the literature discusses such things. So your life prospects should basically be dependent upon the choices you make as opposed to the features and characteristics over which you don't have any control over, okay? Then he goes on to have a discussion about a philosopher, another black philosopher, named Bernard Boxill, okay? And he's objected to this argument. And to some degree, I understand that this argument has some appeal, right? So, but I also understand Bernard Boxill's argument. If you want to know more about Bernard Boxill, he's written several books. He's pretty well read and well reputed black philosopher. But I mean, ultimately what he says is this. Perhaps one's overall life prospects should not be hampered by traits that you're not responsible for. Okay? Many opportunities, goods, and services are legitimately given to some persons and denied to others because of traits for which persons are not responsible. So this is Bernard Boxill, objecting to the last argument that we made, okay? Or that the author presented, okay? And he says, Bernard Boxill is, why can't we do that? Yeah, I mean, generally speaking, you shouldn't be hampered by traits that you're not responsible for. However, many opportunities, goods, and services are legitimately given to some people and are denied to others because of traits for which persons are not responsible. Like, for example, some people are given certain desirable jobs because of their height. Some people are given desirable jobs because they look good. Some people are given, jobs because they're intelligent. They're extremely smart, right? And maybe, intelligence might be, some people, it might be something that comes easy, okay? If such inherited and unchangeable traits allow those who possess them to provide important goods and services, then it is not unjust to prefer those persons for certain jobs, despite the fact that they are not responsible for these traits. Thus, just because no one is responsible for his or her race, it doesn't follow that race should never be a consideration in how a person should be treated. So that's Bernard Boxill's response. And I mean, ultimately, this is Bernard Boxill's argument for the affirmation of affirmative action, because some people will say that affirmative action is unjust because it gives, people racial preferences or even gender preferences, right? Because don't forget, like, the biggest beneficiaries of affirmative action are white women. It's just the facts, okay? But now you got Asians who are like contesting the whole legitimacy of affirmative action because it inconveniences them when it comes to entrance into, certain universities, right? So they're making this argument based upon merit. And shout out to A. Wilson's Ghost. He says, peace, Professor G, got to catch the replay for sure. I'm just doing this, man. I know it's not exciting and titillating, but I think it's necessary. So I'm doing Doing the work, bro. Anyway, a more compelling account of unjust racial discrimination, one that does not rely on or attempt to justify the colorblind principle, focuses on moral status. On this account, racial discrimination is unjust when it treats race as relevant to basic human worth or moral standing. Racial discrimination thus violates the principle that because all persons have inherent and equal moral worth, they should be treated with equal respect. No political morality worthy of consideration holds that the members of some race are moral inferiors or subpersons. If public officials treat the members of a racial group differently because these officials regard them as due less than equal consideration on account of their race, this is surely unjust discrimination. The question is whether all intrinsically unjust racial discrimination can be understood in this way. Now, I mean, going back, I want to go back. So, look, so a person like Bernard Boxill is going to say you can use race as a means by which, to discriminate, not for the sake of making the case that people are subpar or, they're subpersons or anything like that. But he would say, look, we need black doctors. Okay, so like if we need black doctors to service a black population of people, because first of all, black people have an aversion to going to the doctor to begin with because they don't trust the doctors. They don't trust white doctors. And there's good reason. I mean, like say, for example, the Tuskegee experiment. Like black people have an aversion to going to the doctor because they don't trust the doctors or looking out for their, well-being. But, research demonstrates that, black people, especially black men, they feel better going to the doctor if there are more black doctors, or especially black male doctors. And they can talk to, these doctors about like what's going on with their bodies in a way that they can't with, doctors who are not either their, gender or who are not their race. So if it's the case that, like having more doctors would be beneficial to this group, then one could argue maybe we do need to, permit and discriminate and say, okay, on the basis of race, we need to admit more black males into the profession or into the medical schools so that they can enter into the profession so they can service this community. So that's the kind of argument that Bernard Boxill is going to make. Okay, just so you know. Okay, so that's what Bernard Boxill is going to say, okay? So everyone is equal with respect to intrinsic worth and moral status, but individuals and groups do differ with respect to their needs and abilities, and such differences rightly bear on the way they should be treated. From the fact that one is owed equal respect as a human being, it does not follow that one should, in all contexts, be treated the same as others. For example, with regard to the distribution of scarce resources, social services, and value positions. There is a difference between having a right to be treated as an equal and having a right to always receive the same goods, services, and opportunities as others. So there's a difference, right? To be treated as an equal is different than actually just making sure that everybody gets the same thing. So here he's avoiding the whole Marxian conundrum that some people will, present as an objection, because you can foresee it. Oh, this sounds Marxist. Well, he's saying, look, you don't give everybody the same thing. That's not what we're requiring. Treating people and respecting them as equals does not necessarily mean ensuring that everyone receives the same amount of distribution. Okay? So Bernard Williams has argued that because all persons are owed equal respect, there is a standing presumption in favor of treating everyone equally unless there is a relevant difference between persons that rationally justifies differential treatment. it is rational to give medicine to those who are sick and jobs to only those competent to perform them. And so such differential treatment is consistent with equal respect for the sick and the healthy, the competent and the incompetent. But to grant voting rights to only those who are left-handed is to treat right-handed citizens without due respect. I would agree that that's the case. Such treatment is not rational, and thus is arbitrary and naturally resented by those disfavored by such grounds. Armed with this idea, one might argue that because race, as a matter of scientific fact, does not determine a person's needs or abilities, race is always an immaterial criterion for benefiting or burdening someone. But things are not that simple. The relevance of a selection criterion can't be determined without identifying the particular purposes the criterion is supposed to serve. Okay? I mean, this is getting really abstract here, okay? Also, because a selection criterion might serve an institution's purposes well, but these purposes might include such things as exploiting a vulnerable race, we must also assess whether these purposes are legitimate. Thus, a sound principle of differentiation must not only satisfy a condition of relevance and thus rationality, that is, the distinction must be rationally aligned with or likely to advance some policy or institutional goal, but the goal must be one that is one that the discriminating agent is morally permitted to pursue. So, what is a sound principle of differentiation? That's what this sentence actually is trying to tease out. This analysis suggests that it is an open question whether differential treatment based on race might sometimes be justified. For example, if the goal is to increase racial diversity in public schools, contrary to what some advocates of colorblindness suppose. In this connection, it is worth noting that the expressions discrimination on the basis on race and discrimination because of race are often used ambiguously. This ambiguity obscures the morally relevant distinction between treating a person differently, for example, denying her an important opportunity on the grounds that she is a member of an inferior race, and treating her differently, for instance, compensating her for an injustice she has suffered on the grounds that she has been wronged because others believe she is a member of an inferior race. In both cases, the treatment differed on the basis of race, but the race-based considerations are different and the differences are morally important. In particular, the first form of treatment is always impermissible. Okay, so what is the first treatment? Let's go back. Treating her differently or denying her an opportunity on the grounds that she is a filthy fucking nigger. Okay? You can't get into the school. Why not? Because you're a filthy fucking nigger. Now, I'm just using this for effect, okay? In the last case, the second form of treatment may sometimes be morally justified or even required, meaning that because others have wronged you, predicated upon this notion that they feel that you are a filthy nigger, right? In order to rectify the injustice or the opportunities that were denied to you, perhaps maybe we need to take race into consideration. So that's all he's trying to say there, okay? Then he goes on to say, similarly, people use the word because in discrimination because of race, sometimes to mean a normative reason, a consideration in favor of doing something, and sometimes to mean an explanatory cause. So, because of race, sometimes the word invokes a normative reason, And in other cases, it's an explanatory cause, okay? Because reasons can, but need not be causes, to remove the ambiguity, we must distinguish between the proffered reason and the operative reason for an act, okay? This is a lot here. He's getting here. He's an analytic philosopher. Analytic philosophers love to define terms and to play logic games while they're doing so. But, I mean, let's follow his line of reasoning here, okay? So, let's follow his line of reason, okay? Given that people can offer reasons in defense of their discriminatory acts that were not, in fact, the reasons they acted upon, but are mere pretext or rationalization. What does he mean by this? Now let's look at it. I'm gonna read this paragraph one more time so I can try to explain it as best as I can. Okay? Let me start reading the whole paragraph again because I want you to dial into this. It says, similarly, people use the word because in discrimination because of race, sometimes to mean a normative reason and sometimes to mean an explanatory cause. Because reasons can be causes, to remove the ambiguity, we must distinguish between the proffered reason and the operative reason for an act. Given that people can offer reasons in defense of their discriminatory acts that were not, in fact, the reasons they acted upon, but are mere pretext or rationalization. So in other words, you can offer up a reason. That's what proffer means anyway, to offer up. I think about this when I think of dog whistle politics. What does this actually mean? Like, I want to cut taxes. Or I don't want forced busing. This is infringing upon my rights. So there's a difference between the reason that you offer up and the operative reason for an act, what you really are trying to get at, okay? Anyway, it goes on to say, moreover, sometimes the cause of wrongful discrimination is not a reason at all, but a mere bias, sometimes unconscious, that distorts judgment and decision-making, often leading some to be denied opportunities or services to which they are entitled. Recall from the discussion of institutional racism that institutional rules that are otherwise justified can fail to be impartially and consistently applied due to administrative bias. For example, in cases of nepotism, which happens all the time. We live in a nepotistic society, okay? Employment procedures that are otherwise fair or misapplied because familial partiality improperly influences what should have been an impartial decision. Racial partiality can cause similar outcomes, and not only when the bias is against another group, but also when the bias is for one's own group. When this happens, an injustice has occurred that we can rightly classify as wrongful discrimination. Now the question, this question is relevant. And I'm going to leave you with the question here. And this is just a question. Savada66 says, I'm not finished with part 2. Hey, man, go back and check it out. But here's the question. So let's say, for example, if Jewish people decide that they're going to favor themselves when it comes to hiring practices, are they wrong for that? Or they engage in racial discrimination because of that? If black people do it, are they wrong for doing it? If Muslims do it, are they wrong for doing it? If Hispanics do it, are they wrong for doing it? Right? I mean, because one can argue, okay, like if you say, look, we got restrictive covenants. We only want white people to live here. Or we're only going to give leases to white people. in this apartment complex in this affluent area. Or we're going to limit the amount of black people who can live here because we want it to be predominantly white. Is that immoral? So, I mean, one could argue that, looking out for your own group, it can be racist. I mean, saying I only want my group of people to vote. So are you supposed to treat other people as, unequals? Because that's how groups act. I mean, that's what you're supposed to do? You got to start thinking, you got to carry out these things that, because I hear this being said, everybody else discriminates against us, but we don't discriminate against them. We need to be more like them. Maybe we'll start winning. But the question is, really? Is that really what you really want that? I mean, think about it. Is that really what you want? Is that really what you're calling for? Anyway, the author goes on to say, with these distinctions in place, I can summarize in this way the concept of wrongful racial discrimination that he's been defending, okay? When a person, and this is the definition here, when a group or a person is denied an opportunity, a resource, or public benefit, this constitutes unjust racial discrimination if the unfavorable treatment is based on the normative presumption, perhaps implicit, that one race has inferior moral status to another, is based on racial considerations when race is not a relevant principle of differentiation that would further a legitimate end, or has been caused by a racially biased application of institutional rules. Race-based discrimination that takes any of these forms is fundamentally unjust and intrinsically wrong. So I want you to think about this. If it is the case that only looking out for your own group is there's nothing problematic with it, and everybody else does it, and we don't do it, then why are we complaining about it? Like, for example, not giving black people FHA loans, not giving black people access to the GI Bill. I mean, you got to think about it. Not, allowing black people to be free. It's not in the interest of their group. So you got to be careful about what it is that you endorse. I get that, other groups of people are discriminatory and they do things that, are often prejudicial and discriminatory or whatever, but come on, man. We gotta start thinking. Anyway, notice that this account of unjust racial discrimination doesn't depend on the discriminator intentionally seeking to harm members of the disfavored racial group, nor in the second form of discrimination. I don't know why I'd put a box there. Nor in the second form of discrimination does it depend on the discriminator having racist beliefs or sentiments. Now, white people have begun to redefine racism as a negative sentiment or a racist belief. So they've, for the most part, in my viewpoint, I see them as having hijacked race. But, then he goes on to say, yet when malicious intent or racial prejudice is the source of the unjust discrimination, this creates an additional wrong from which the law might seek to protect certain groups, particularly those socially salient. groups who suffer because these attitudes are widespread. Socially salient means, like they're easily discernible, okay? You can see them easy. Anyway, this wrong is an expressive harm, a form of stigmatizing, insulting, or demeaning others. Indeed, an expressive harm may occur even if the discriminator does not actually have malicious intent or prejudice towards those discriminated against. Let me turn that shit off. Hold on. Damn, it gets on my nerves. Shit, come on too much. Anyway, indeed, an expressive harm may occur even if the discriminator does not actually have malicious intent or prejudice towards those discriminated against. It is often enough if a suitably informed and impartial observer, given whom the discriminator is, and the social context would interpret the action as conveying such intentions, beliefs, or sentiments. Anyway, that he's getting hair splitty here, but anyway, this is all preliminary shit anyway, because he's really not going into the ghetto. He's just defining terms like what does discrimination mean? What does racism mean? He's just trying to lay it all out on the table before he begins to use the terms, and then the terms can be misconstrued or, some kind of ambiguity in the terms could be, brought up such that the points don't have any substance anymore. So he's just trying to make it clear about what he means when he's talking about discrimination that's morally wrong, okay? So anyway, he says, I believe that the account of unjust discrimination presented here also works mutatis mutandis for wrongful discrimination based on gender or class origins, two social categories that are especially relevant for thinking about ghetto poverty. For ease of exposition, I think he's pandering there, but it is what it is. Anyways, I presented the account focusing on race, but it should be clear that men and women and individuals from different class backgrounds also possess equal moral status and should be treated as equals. That is, regarded with equal concern and respect by the public institutions of society. Differential treatment based on gender or class origins is unjust unless it is based on a relevant principle of differentiation that would further a legitimate end. So, this whole idea that you can have differential treatment if it's going to lead to a legitimate end is a Rawlsian principle called the difference principle. I am not going to get into it, but the difference principle says if there are going to be differences in the allocation of resources or positions, then the allocation of those, the differential, allocation of resources or positions has to be predicated upon leading to a greater advantage for disadvantaged persons. Some shit like that, okay? It's called the difference principle. Look it up. So he goes on to say gender and class biases can and often do upset the even-handed application of institutional rules. And of course, malicious intent and prejudice are often directed towards women and those of lower socioeconomic status. And these widespread attitudes are frequently the cause of unjust discrimination against members of these groups, creating expressive harms that need to be combated if all are to have equal citizenship. Now, we need to get into this. Because one of the things that, most people do is they just make this assumption that, like there are all these gender biases in our culture and in our society, and that, all of the biases are such that they move fluidly, or I won't even say fluidly, but they move discernibly from rights and privileges being given to men over that of women. And when you start to put race into the mix and you start to put class into the mix, it complicates these issues. And I just don't think that, most authors, even philosophers, pay attention to this, especially pre-Curry. They just automatically assume that, women are disadvantaged over men in general. And I just don't think that that's the case. I just don't think that that's the case. But I'm not going to go over poverty, class, and equal opportunity. I'm going to say that for later because this thing goes to page 49. I'm not about to read to page 49 tonight, bro. I'm not about to do it, bro. It goes to 40. I'm not about to do that shit tonight, bro. No, sir. Yeah, it goes, I think it goes to, page 49 is where it goes. I'm not about to read all that shit tonight, bro. But this is a black philosopher. If anybody's got any questions, they want to add anything, they want to say something, if you disagree or agree with what's been said thus far, you can come up and step up and say something if you want to. I want to give a shout out to some people who hit me up on the Cash App. Well, one guy who hit me up on the Cash App, because two people hit me up on the Cash App. Sailor X, I want to give him a shout out, and Greg Wilson. Appreciate your donations, man. Appreciate that. Appreciate that. Anybody has any questions, they can come up now. Otherwise, I'm about to sign off, and I'll probably wait till next week to do this again, because I'm getting tired of it. I got to take a break every now and then myself. If I was teaching a seminar, I would probably only do this once a week. I probably wouldn't do it twice a week. Or even definitely not 3 times a week unless it was an undergraduate course. But, just reading through this, all he's doing is trying to lay out the terms first. And then before he gets into the specific issues, right? And thank you for subscribing, Static Art. So if nobody has any questions, man, I'm about to get off here, man. I'm gonna holler at y'all on the next one. So I'll do this probably next week. But I think I want to talk about something different. Maybe tomorrow. I might not. It all depends. But anyway, this is the 3rd installment of me reading through this book. We're not really at the interesting parts of the book yet, but trust me, it gets interesting, and it touches on everything people in this space talk about. I'm talking about everything. Nothing gets left out. Trust me, nothing gets left out. So having said all that, man, I will holler at y'all on the next one. Peace. Holler at y'all.